for some reason that you think, yeah, listen, the way I work doesn't suit that variety, or my land doesn't suit that variety, well then yes, you take how that variety performed in the previous year and say, well listen, maybe this variety isn't for me. Maybe there's a variety out there which stands better, or yields better, or something like that, or has better disease characteristics than what I'm capable of looking after, or what I did last year.
Harvest is almost complete, but for beans still in the field. Attention is shifted on most farms to next year's harvest. Choosing the variety or number of varieties to be sown on the farm and a corresponding seed rate for each variety is all important when ordering your seed. Have you made up your mind about the varieties for your farm for next year? You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. There are a large number of varieties available on the Department of Agriculture winter barley and winter wheat recommended list this year. At first glance, you might say there's very little difference between the varieties, but once you dig a little bit deeper, there's a lot to consider. I'm delighted to welcome Shay, Phelan and Ciaran Collins, both Tillage Specialists in Teagasc, to go through these varieties and their suitability for different farm circumstances. Ciaran, I want to come to you first and talk about winter barley. There are a good few new varieties on the recommended list this year. What stands out for you?
Oh, I think in the winter barley list, Michael, is really positive. We have 6 fully recommended varieties, and then we've got 3 provisionally recommended this year. So from a grower's perspective, there is a really good selection of varieties there.
So from the 3 provisionals, they're all new to the list this year, Ciaran?
Yeah, we've Integral, Arcade and Canyon. So Integral is BYDV-tolerant. It's a 6-row conventional variety. There was a bit of a round last year, and I think it yielded really well. It's 104 under 3 years. And then we've Arcade, which is a 2-row conventional, and that is BYDV tolerance as well. And then we've got a very interesting 6-row hybrid in Canyon. So that's really high yielding, and will be of interest to growers, maybe particularly those that would be used to growing belfry.
Okay, and given the fact, Ciaran, that there was an awful lot of BYDV around last year, and look, arguably, I think winter barley probably didn't perform terribly well for anyone last year for the most part. As regards the total quantities of seed that's out there, how much of that seed is ranked as having the genetics of BYDV tolerance or resistance in it?
Yeah, I suppose it's just the way the breeding program is going, which is really positive. But like over a third of the seed has BYDV tolerance, or B varieties with BYDV tolerance, which is a real positive. And like we did see that. It wasn't a vintage year for winter barley last year, but I don't think BYDV was really the big issue. It was probably sowing conditions and all of that. But we did see, and it is in the 1-year results from the department, certainly there seemed to be more BYDV pressure in the northern half, and the BYDV tolerant varieties did work better up there, did perform better. So I suppose that's really good news for us, because that indicates that this genetics is working for growers.
Okay, great. Shay, just to bring you in there, and Ciaran was talking a little bit about the differences in some of the varieties there, and varieties have a lot of parameters on that recommended list. Which of those parameters should a grower look at to make a decision as regards this one's coming onto my farm? Because look, I suppose an awful lot of guys look at the very top line, and if it's a 110 versus the 108, I have a fairly good idea which most farmers will jump at. But is that the right way to go about it?
Yeah, you're right, Michael. I mean, the first thing generally people do is they look at the yield of the variety. So as you say, they look and see, they're rated from 100% and up and down from that. So they'll look at those and say, well, right, that's going to yield me, so much more than variety A is going to yield me so much more than variety B. So I go with that. But you're correct. I mean, that doesn't tell the full tale at all. So really, if you look down the recommended list for all the varieties, not just barley, but wheat and oats as well, you have things like straw strength and resistance to lodging and straw breakdown. And then you have your disease characteristics as well, and your grain quality. So, you need to be cognizant of those. So you might have a variety that might be yielding, say, 105 or 106 or 107. But actually, when you look at its lodging score, it might be susceptible to lodging. So in a year where lodging is a big factor, you may lose that yield benefit from the fact that the crop is on the floor. So if you take something like Teagasc, which is quite a good crop to stand, that's good measurement of that crop, that it'll be there no matter what the weather is like. no matter what the weather's like, but in tough lodging conditions, it'll stand better than some of the other varieties, maybe like Somalia or Cassia or something like that. And likewise with the disease one, and I think this is one that people are becoming more and more aware of, the disease ratings of crops as well, because disease control is not cheap anymore. It is can be quite expensive. So if you pick a dirty variety, although it might be giving you extra yield, you may be spending half or maybe three quarters of that extra yield that you get on your fungicide cost. So if you take something like Cassia, which is relatively susceptible to rincosporium and mildew at this stage, you may have to tailor a fungicide program, and it may take extra fungicides in that case to get the crop yield that's rated at the top end of the table. So I mean, you really need to just take notes of the yield ratings, but also look at the other characteristics as well, because they're as equally as important as yield in terms of the overall profitability of the crop.
And I've heard a number of growers is talking in the last few weeks, and they were kind of saying, this variety didn't do particularly well on my farm this year, and don't think I'm ever going to go it again. How much of a cognizance should growers take of, the last year's performance versus the year before that, Shay?
Well, I mean, you have to take a little bit of a dive back from, or stand back from the variety a little bit and have a look first in terms of the conditions from the start to finish, and see, first of all, was there anything that you could have done better in terms of sowing, in terms of treatments, in terms of fertilizer application, all those type of things, and rate that then in terms of how well did you do yourself in terms of how you carried out the work for the year. And then look at the effect it had on the variety. So if for some reason that you think, listen, the way I work doesn't suit that variety, or my land doesn't suit that variety, well then yes, you take how that variety performed in the previous year and say, well listen, maybe this variety isn't for me. Maybe there's a variety out there which stands better, or yields better, or something like that, or has better disease characteristics than what I'm capable of looking after, or what I did last year. And then make the decision on the variety that, listen, that variety is quite dirty. I wasn't able to get in early enough because my soil type didn't suit. It was too wet. Couldn't get in and get a fungicide on that earlier enough. So you go with something with maybe slightly lower yield, but maybe better disease characteristics, and say, listen, I can get in whenever in the late March, early April to spray that crop with a fungicide, and that gets me out. So you might have to make a decision or a compromise based on those type of things rather than the top line, which is the yield.
Okay. Ciaran, for farmers who have a considerable or going to plant a considerable acreage of winter barley, is there a second or third variety that they should be looking at, in terms of lighter or heavier ground, or perhaps distance from the yard, that, if when you look at all the varieties and all the different parameters, this might be one that might suit in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have a variety which, say, choose Tardis as an example, it would be probably the biggest variety out there. It's a really sort of a variety that will fit almost every slot, in the sense that, it's good standing, it's good disease, good grain. But like, you certainly would have to look at other parameters if you're growing, a large area of winter barley. So the first thing that BYDV tolerance would have to come into the equation, maybe get some one of those in first. That would be one consideration. I suppose the other one then is earliness of ripening. Is always something you want to we quite often get straw breakdown, once some of these barley varieties, high yielding ones, are ripe, so you want something maybe a little bit of earliness ripening, which is again going to spread those harvest dates a bit anyway. They would be certainly two key parameters. And then, I suppose there is no harm in maybe looking a little bit towards the future. So if you've grown, say if you're a hybrid, 6-row hybrid grower, say Belfry, maybe get a bit of Kenyan in there to have a look at that, and then see how that's going, because that could be your future variety. So I think that they'd be the kind of parameters you'd be really looking at,
Ciaran, when you mentioned earliness of ripening, you have scores there across the line, kind of from 6 to 8 on that. A lot of them kind of falling between 6 and 7. You might give us an idea in terms of what does that actually mean, practically or physically on the ground. Is that a difference of a couple of days in terms of being ripe, or is it a week, or what is it?
Yeah, so you look at something, I suppose the two that would stick out would be Joyo and Integral. They've got 8s for earliness of ripening, and all the rest are kind of 7s apart from Tardis, Cassia, and Arcade actually would be 6. So you're generally only talking about a few days. But I think what we've seen with the likes of Joyo, because we've more experience of it, we certainly see earlier development, particularly through the autumn and into the spring. And that tends to, it still will be the one that you'll harvest first, but it may only be a few days come harvest. But I think that's important because, again, look, at harvest time, it does give you that little degree of flexibility, but also in the spring as well, when you're trying to get out with fertilizer or you're trying to get out with maybe growth regulator or disease control, you have a variety that you can, I can go there first, and then if the weather's broken, I can go to the other variety second, that sort of thing, and I suppose just to be aware and, not to sow too early some of these earlier maturing varieties, because, you will tend to, we can get late frosts and that, so you kind of an impact there, which can be negative of it. So, I think it's, as you said, it's trying to find the balance across the number of varieties that you're growing.
Okay, perfect. Shay, you might give us an idea in terms of the seeding rate that we might use on winter barley. Like, what's the targets in terms of the plants that a farmer should try and aim for in terms of establishing the field, 6 weeks later?
Yeah, so you're right, Michael. In terms of winter barley, really, you need to be looking at, if you're starting, say, this week, which is the last week of September, you're probably looking at about somewhere, 290, 300 seeds per, or 300 plants per meter squared. So you're probably going to be drilling somewhere around 310, 320 seeds to get that. So as you move on then into October, you're going to probably up that by 5 or 10% every week as you go through October. To try and keep those seed rates up, because at the end of the day, we're trying to target that 1,000 or 1,100 shoots per square meter when the heads come out. So we need to give the crop every chance that it can get to that, bearing in mind that most plants will carry maybe 3 tillers. So you're trying to get that end date and then work back to calculate your seed rate. So I think that's where you kind of need to have your thinking hat on in terms of that 1,000 to 1,100 heads per square meter, divided by 3, and then get it back to where your seed rate comes in at the start. So, I suppose most people would target around the 300 plants per square meter. When you go in that a bit earlier, you're probably going to get that half tiller more on average across crops, so you can reduce your seed rate slightly. But I'd still try and get it in that kind of, at the moment, 290, 300 plants per square meter, and drilling at probably about, that works out, say, about 100 and, maybe 156, 160 kilos per hectare, which is about 10 stone an acre, but you'll be increasing that from now on, probably by, no goods of half a stone, if you like, in old money, every week from now on. And
of course, there is a big difference in 1,000 grain weights and
exactly. I'm just taking an average there, Michael. So you have to take your 1,000 grain weight and work them out. We have a calculator there, which we can do that. So we can talk about that later on.
Yeah, and the likes of, just looking here, our Arcade would have a very big seed in terms of 1,000 grain weight in comparison.
Yeah.
Maybe to something like Armadillo or some of the other ones that's on it. So you're going to have a good bit more seed in that one.
I think that's a key point, Michael, in that every variety comes with 1,000 grain weight on the bag. So when you look at that 1,000 grain weight, you should use that figure then to calculate your seed rate. So again, trying to target that kind of, at the moment, 290 to 300 plants per square meter, and then work back from that then after that, which are 1,000 grain weight.
Okay. Just sticking with you, Shay, just moving on to wheat for a second. Is there anything of note in the winter wheat variety list this year, or is it a bit of the same, given all the difficulties I suppose we've had last year or this year gone out with septoria control especially? Yeah,
it is, Michael. It's a bit of same old. I mean, that's one of the challenges for wheat breeders over the last number of years is to try and get varieties that are where, septoria being our big problem here, which have good septoria resistance and have good yield. And that's the challenge, I suppose, that a lot of breeders are struggling to overcome, to be fair, over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And as a result, then, when you look at the winter wheat recommended list this year, we've only 6 varieties on the list. And, some of them, we know them well at this stage, like Graham, Thorpe, Dawson, and even Spearhead. Like we've grown those quite a bit over the last number of years. So we kind of know the strengths and weaknesses of those. And there's only 2 really provisionally recommended varieties that are coming on the market now. They're Champion and Fitzroy. So the choice, I suppose, isn't brilliant. And especially when you take that Graham is probably going to take up most of the is not going to take up is most of the available seed that's out there. So most people are probably at this stage who grow wheat are pretty familiar with Graham in terms of what it does, in terms of that risk of yellow rust early on, but it tends to disappear after a while. But again, from the point of view of Septoria is the one disease that a lot of the varieties that are out there at the moment are struggling with, and there's no point in shying away from that. So you do have to, when you commit to growing winter wheat, you do have to bear in mind that you're going to have to put a fairly robust fungicide program in place.
For the two new ones there, just to focus on those for a little second, the Champion and Fitzroy, how much seed, first of all, is available? From what I remember, there's not a huge amount of Fitzroy maybe out there, but there's probably a reasonable amount of Champion. But you might just maybe, the highs and lows maybe of those two varieties in particular, because maybe growers mightn't be as familiar with them.
Yeah, well, if I start with the old one, Michael, what we were talking about earlier on, if you start with yield, Champion is the highest yielding variety on the list. So that's, I suppose, a good point from that. It has a slightly better Septoria and disease profile than the other varieties, albeit, and I suppose this is something that people have to look at when they look at the recommended list. If you look at the figures for both Champion and Fitzroy being provisionally recommended, you will see all their scores are in brackets. And basically, that means that's the best that score that parameter is going to be. And generally, they deteriorate over time. So if you have a score of 6 or 7 this year, that will probably go down to a 5 or 6 next year, the year after. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at those varieties. And when you look at something like Champion, yes, it has a relatively good disease package compared to everything else. The one Achilles heel, I suppose, for it is potentially straw strength. And now we didn't see a huge amount of lodging in it in 2024, but in 2023, it certainly was something that you would be a little bit concerned about. So in that case, for the likes of Champion, I think it's about 12 or 13% of the seed this year. You'd need to bear in mind that you're going to have to put in a fairly robust straw shortening campaign in that. So just something to be aware of.
So Shay, just in that before we move on, so what does that look like for a grower, just so he has a vision of it? Is that kind of a modus cycocell at growth stage 30-31, followed by a big dollop of Turple, somewhere after growth stage 32-33, something like that? Is that what it is?
Yeah, you're looking, certainly, Michael, you're looking at a two application strategy in terms of a growth regulator, and pretty decent rates. So you're not looking at reducing rates to try and save costs. You are going to have to spend that little bit more, probably on the likes of a variety, likes of Champion, and to make sure it stands, because ultimately, if it lodges, you're going to lose yield. So that extra benefit you get from yield, you're going to lose it. So you do need to spend that extra little bit more on a growth regulator.
And Fitzroy then, I mean, it looks reasonable yield, shade. The disease package looks pretty good. It's probably, I think it just looking at it here, looks like the best of the Septoria, albeit, as you say, in brackets. Is there anything in particular that a grower should be concerned about in that variety?
Yeah, and again, it's something that we haven't seen for the last number of years, and it's the risk of fusarium. If you see the score of fusarium in it, it's quite low compared to other varieties. So that's just something that you would be nervous of if you got a year where fusarium is an issue. So that's just something that you'd be a little bit concerned about. As I say, there's not a huge amount of seed about, but there's only 1 or 2% of the seed available is going to be Fitzroy this year. So for those people who do get access to it, that kind of T3 timing is probably going to be a bit more of a concern than some of the other varieties.
Okay. Ciaran, just to bring you back in, and kind of a similar question to winter barley around, a grower who's putting in a fairly large acreage, what would be the complementary variety to the main varieties out there? I mean, how would you slice it and dice it if you had a reasonable area?
Okay, I think that's a great question, because I think with winter wheat at the moment, and Shay kind of alluded to it there, look, we did have a little bit of a lag because of our cougar resistance ones that we lost. But having said that, we can chat about it in a minute. There's some good stuff coming through as well. But I think it is important to have a spread of wheat varieties. Look, Shay pointed out they all have their little strengths and weaknesses. Graham, yellow rust, and Dawson, obviously Septoria, just to pick those two. So again, I think if I'm a grower in Cork, probably going to be slimming down maybe a little bit on Dawson, whereas it could be the opposite way around if I'm further up the country. So I think having that balance is certainly very important. Champion is 20% of the seed. It's a high yielder. Given a great chance, it will deliver high yields. But as Shay said, you kind of need to just watch the growth regulator there. So again, I'm picking a field there, maybe maybe not, well, not say not the highest fertility, but certainly I'm watching the nitrogen on that one and then matching it up with a good growth regulator program. So I think the three of those can complement very well with each other. And also Fitzroy, I mean, look, it's a tiny amount of seed, to be fair. It is, a late developer. So again, maybe if you did have a bit of that might be something that you might think about sowing early, take advantage of that's better septoria resistance, and then it is that kind of later developer. So you are trying to mix it, and I think that's just a crucial point of winter wheat this year. Just mix the varieties. Don't rely on one single variety for anybody growing any kind of a reasonable acreage.
So Shay, I'm just going to just pop back to you for a second. You mentioned you were talking about seed rates in winter barley a minute ago. Where should growers go in terms of seed rates for winter wheat?
Yeah, and again, Michael, similar story with winter wheat in terms of look at the 1,000 grain weight first on the seed bags and then calculate your rate from there. I suppose, again, where we are at the moment, last week of September, you're probably looking at a target stand of somewhere around 240, 250 plants per square metre. So you're looking at a seed rate, depending on the 1,000 grain weight, of anything from probably 280 seeds per square metre up to maybe about 300 seeds per square metre. But again, as I say, it depends on the 1,000 grain weight. And likewise, when you're moving through into next week, first week of October and all the way through October, you increase the seed rate incrementally based on just the time of year and also the germination conditions, the establishment rate based on soil conditions. So as soils tend to get, stickier towards the end of October, the germination or establishment rate tends to disimprove. So you need to just take cognizance of that. So if we start now at about last week of September of somewhere around 250 plants per square metre, you're probably going to be somewhere up to, depending on soil conditions, somewhere around 280, 290, maybe 300 plants per square metre target population by the end of October. So that's the kind of range of where you would be over the next month or so, Michael, if you like.
Okay. Ciaran, just last question to you, kind of around, I suppose, early sowing. Now, maybe we could argue it's not really early anymore, certainly maybe not up this part of the country or the further north you go. But you might maybe just list out some of the factors that people should consider if planting in the next few days. Yeah,
I suppose, again, as you said, it depends where you are. It's probably not early anymore for, say, the northern half, or certainly in the northeast. I suppose, again, early sowing will exacerbate things like disease, particularly septoria. So that's something you certainly need to keep in mind. And, the further south you go, there's always that trade-off with good sowing conditions versus, reducing the risk of both BYDV and disease. And I suppose the third one to mention is lodging. Earlier sowing, you tend to get, better establishment. You can get more tillers. So again, that won't help in a lodging scenario. All the advantages are for delayed sowing in general. However, we're all scarred from the last 2 Octobers being so wet. So it is all about trying to find that little balance there. And I think it depends on where you are as well in terms of how early you go, Michael. If I can add, Michael, just before you wrap up, just I suppose not to be negative all the time, and certainly look, we're just in probably a little transition period with our varieties, but there is certainly some good new material coming through. There's an NOS variety. I think it's going to be called Bullseye. Did really, really well in the OBS trials in Ballydaround this year. Cubic did the same, and Equip, really, really good varieties on Septoria. So that's promising going forward. You have another variety called Scope. I think there might be a bit of Rebellion and Hexton coming through the system again next year. So I suppose we are seeing start the return of some very, very interesting varieties that will help us going forward.
Brilliant. Some great news in that. And I suppose just on that, maybe for growers that they would maybe, I suppose, take note of some of those varieties and, chat to their neighbours locally, or maybe even seed merchants, and kind of say, well, where are these varieties grown? I'd love to have a look at them through the year and keep an eye on them either there or in some of the department trial sites that are. I think it's well worth people's while, especially in winter wheat, to do that and to get an idea about how or what they might look like in their own farm this time next year, hopefully. Ciaran and Shay, thanks very much as always for your insights into everything like this. We didn't talk about oats today, but there's a reason for that. It's probably a little bit early, and we will come back and we'll talk about oats again another day. So guys, thanks very much again.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me on the show. Ciaran and Shay will be joining me on the show next week to chat about the pre-emerge herbicide options which are available for both wheat and barley. So that's it for this week, and if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.